and I want to go to John chapter 13 and begin at verse 1. We're going to look at servant lordship, how that God has called us to know how to walk as servants. And Jesus was our great example, as he was willing to gird himself and bow down as a servant and wash the feet of the disciples. It says, "Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour had come, that he should depart from the world to the Father, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. The supper being ended, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come from God and was going to God, rose from supper and laid aside his garments, took a towel and girded himself. After that he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel which he was girded. Then when he came to Simon Peter, Peter said to him, 'Lord, are you washing my feet?' Jesus answered and said to him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. Peter said to him, 'You will never wash my feet.' Jesus answered him, 'If I do not wash you, you have no part with me.' Simon Peter said to him, 'Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head.' Jesus said to him, 'He who has bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. You are clean, but not all of you.' For he knew who would betray him. Therefore he said, 'You are not all clean.' So when he had washed their feet, taking his garment, he sat down again, and he said to them, 'Do you know what I have done to you? You call me Master and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If then your Lord and teacher has washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who sent greater than he who sent him. If you know these things, blessed are you if you do them.'" Hallelujah. This is an awesome picture that we have at probably a week, somewhat close to a week before Jesus was crucified. He goes and he washes the disciples' feet. He takes this position of a servant. A couple of weeks ago, Wayne Shank was sharing that the Old Testament word for bless, which is the word barak, is the root word for kneeling. And it's primarily, the focus of this word is kneeling before a deity, primarily kneeling before God. And he mused about what it means that God bless man. For example, how God blessed Abraham, and he put that blessing on Abraham. Does this mean that God knelt down and served Abraham? Is that what it's speaking of? And he shared this, and it kind of troubled me a little bit, especially without context. But you know, many things can be true, but they can be also dangerous. And there's a lot of truths in the Bible that are true, but they can be dangerous if we don't keep them within the context and the understanding of where it's supposed to fit. Especially in this man-centered world that we live in, where we have developed a man-centered theology. It sounds like a very dangerous point to bring out. Here in this story of the foot washing done a week before the Passover, Jesus, who is God, kneels down and he washes the disciples' feet. Exactly what we see in this word from the Old Testament. But notice how John, as he writes this, he's careful to include and emphasize the context here. There's no question that Jesus takes on the role of the slave. He takes a towel, he takes off his cloak, he puts his towel, wraps around him, and in Luke 17 verse 8 it says, "But will he not rather say to his servant, 'Prepare my supper, gird yourself and serve me, and after I have eaten and drunk, after you will eat and drink.'" So this was a normal thing for a servant to do. They would gird themselves with this towel, and then they would begin to wash the feet. So Jesus obviously took that position in this situation. This is what Paul talks about in Philippians 2:7, where he says, "He made himself of no reputation. He took on himself the form of a bondservant, and in the likeness of man." So there is a certain sense where Jesus came as a servant. He came to serve. And he took that place of a servant. He took that place, as it were, to bow down and to share. And this is a pretty ominous thing to understand, a pretty incredible thing when we think about God. But we need to notice what John says in verse 3. He says in verse 3, he said, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hand, and that he had come from God, and that he was going to God. In other words, Jesus was absolutely secure in his position as Lord and ruler of all. You know, as I was thinking about myself when I was a kid in high school, you know, there were times where my insecurity didn't allow me to do certain things. Because I was a Christian kid in the school, people knew I was a Christian. You know, I tried to be kind and caring towards some of the people who were rejected. But, you know, when push really came to shove, there's a few times I remember where I was really cornered into this position. That I knew if I went and I stood with this person that was being rejected, that I would partake of their rejection. And if I had been totally secure in myself, I could have gone and stood with that person, but I wasn't. I remember a couple times I just took off, I ran. Didn't know what to do. It was like I was cornered into that situation. But here we have Jesus who was absolutely secure. Right. He was absolutely secure. So he could do this. He could take on that form of a servant. He could bow down. He could wash these feet because he knew who he was. And you know, I think that's a great challenge for us. Do we know who we are? What is our security? What is that place we're at? Do we know that we're a child of God? And that we have that identity that makes us completely secure, no matter who rejects us in this world. No matter who comes against us or tries to bring us down. That's where Jesus was. He was in that position. He was not divesting himself of that position by taking the servant's position. It was all part of who he was and what he was called to do. And so, this was not something that Jesus was doing outside of who he was. He was doing something about who he really was. As Lord and Master, he could bow down and be a servant. It's a pretty amazing thing. After he'd washed the feet and put his cloak back on, he says this, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. For I have given you example that you should do as I have done to you. Most assuredly I say to you, a servant is not greater than his master, nor is he who sent greater than he who sent him." So I believe that this emphasis is very, very important. Jesus was still very much their Lord and teacher. Even though he took that time to bow down and wash their feet, he was still Lord and teacher. He was still in that place of authority. He was not under their command. His servanthood was self-initiated, not forced. And there's a huge difference between that, right? The disciples were not forcing him to wash their feet. The disciples didn't say, "Come on here, Jesus, wash my feet." There's no way they would have done that. We see that in Peter's attitude, the way he responded. And so even though we have this understanding that God has bowed down in some sense to serve us, we recognize that he's still Lord and Master, and he's not our servant.
Right.
And we can't command him, okay? We're not the ones that have authority over him. Even when Jesus was taken by human hands and crucified, it was because he willingly allowed them to do it. His purpose was not to get the disciples to see him as their servant or to allow them to command him as their servant. In fact, he tells them not to think that they are in any way greater than their master. They're not to ever think that. He makes that clear. Rather, his purpose was to be an example of how they were to serve others. They were to wash one another's feet. They were to bow down and do that. He wanted his disciples to become servant leaders in the church. Now, just as a little aside, the faith movement has used the verse in Jeremiah in the King James in Isaiah 45 verse 11. It says, "Thus saith the Lord, the Holy One of Israel, and his Maker, ask of me things to come concerning my sons, concerning the works of the hands, my hands command ye me." And a lot of faith preachers have preached this, and they said, you know what, we can command God. We can command him according to the work of his hands, especially in the relation of his promises. We have the authority. We can tell God what he should do in this particular situation, that he should come and bless us, that he should come and change the situation. We have the authority to command him. But the problem is, this is taken severely out of context. If we just go 2 verses before this, in verse 9, this is what God says. He says, "Woe unto him who striveth with his Maker. Let the potsherds strive with the potsherds of the earth. Shall the clay say to him that fashioned it, what makest thou? Or thy work, he has no hands? So what God is pointing out is he's pointing out the foolishness of the pot, speaking to the potter and saying, potter, you got to change, you got to do something different. In other words, God is just saying the exact opposite of what these faith teachers have been teaching. God was saying, are you crazy? You're the pot. I'm the potter. I'm the one that shaped you. I'm the one that formed you. I'm the one that has the authority. You're not commanding me. I've made you for my purpose. I've made you for my reason. So God wants us to understand that. The word strive here, it says, woe unto him that striveth with his master. The word strive means to grapple, to wrangle, to chide, to complain, to contend, or to debate. And if you remember a number of weeks ago, we talked about coming out from under God's authority to alongside. Somehow we think we can debate with God. Somehow we think we can chide God. We can complain to God. You know what? That's not our position. And every time we do it, we're putting ourselves in a dangerous situation where God has to correct us. You know, I've just been reading through the first books of the Bible there in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and boy, every time those people complain, they sure get into trouble. They get fiery snakes that come and bite them all, and the earth opens up and swallows them. All kinds of wild things. God is teaching us, and Paul says, you know what? Look back at those things because there's something that will teach you. Don't complain like they did. All right? So we need to have the right understanding here and not be foolish. He says, woe to those who do these things. Basically, woe to those who try to command me. The NIV puts the verse this way. It says, this is what the Lord says, the Holy One of Israel and its Maker, concerning things to come. Do you question me about my children, or give me orders about the work of my hands? It is I who made the earth and created mankind. I think I like that translation a bit better, because that's what the context brings out. Well, who are you to question me? Now, this is pretty much the same answer that God gave to Job, right? Job was having all kinds of questions. He was questioning God. And God comes to him in Job 38 and verse 3. He says, now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you and you will answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched out the line upon it? Right? Yeah, I've told you that little story, where the little ant was riding on top of the elephant. The elephant went across the bridge, and the bridge shook, and the ant said, boy, did we shake that bridge. It's kind of like us. We're kind of the little ant on top of the elephant. And we think that we've done something. God says, what have you done? You're just a little speck on top of the ball of earth that I put into its perfect place. Perfect place. And I've put you there, but you don't have much effect. And we can be like the psalmist. Oh God, how could you be mindful of us? How could you stoop down to acknowledge me as a human being? I mean, this just blows our mind. It's beyond anything that we could conceive. But it doesn't make him our servant. I think that's so important. We need to understand that just means that God has stooped down to love us in a way that's just unfathomable. It's just incredible what he did. So we need to know and know under certain terms who the Lord really is. Let's go back to our text here in verse 6. It says, then he came to Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, are you washing my feet? Jesus answered and said to him, what I am doing you do not understand now, but you will know after this. Peter said, you shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, if I do not wash you, you have no part in me. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, but also my hands and my head. Jesus said to him, he who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. You are clean, but not all of you. Now obviously Peter was a little confused about what was going on. He could not fathom that Jesus as Master, as Messiah, as Lord would wash his feet. And I think we can really understand this. If we really know who God is, and Peter had confessed that Jesus was the Messiah, and he was beginning, the disciples are coming to more and more respect Jesus. So they're going through this, they're seeing who he really is, and all of a sudden here he is girding himself. And Peter says, no, this isn't right, Jesus. This isn't right. You shouldn't be bowing down and washing my feet. You shouldn't be doing this. This just isn't right. He was stuck in the mindset that those who are greater serve the lesser. Are served by the lesser, I should say. So he was stuck in that mindset. The great ones, they get served by the servants. Jesus, we're supposed to serve you. You're not supposed to serve us. This doesn't make sense. He knew that the higher your status in the world, the greater your authority, the more servants you would have to serve you. Status must be maintained to preserve the proper order. If you look back in history, it's amazing how many times the serfs or the people, the rabble, the unwashed masses were put down because the people who were the elite said they need to know their place. When there came a little bit of rebellion, when the serfs started to rise up a little bit, boy, there was a heavy-handed bringing down of those people so often. Why was that? Because the social order needed to be kept into place. And if someone who was of a higher social order was to stoop down and begin to care for those lower ones, they would be rejected. They would even be arrested because they were undermining the social order. And this is what Peter began to see. He saw this anyways. He said, Jesus, you're undermining the whole social order. This is not the way things work. This is not the way things work in Israel. This is not the way things work in Rome. This is not the way things work in Greece. Jesus, what are you doing? This is not right. I'm not going to let you do this, Jesus. I think we've heard him say that before, haven't we? Well, Peter needed to understand God's plan. Peter's struggle was, can the master wash my feet and still be master? And I think that's sometimes something we struggle with. Can we know the great love given to us by God and still respect and honor him? And we can, but sometimes we see in the world that people get a little too familiar with God. They start to talk about God's love, they start talking about God's grace, and all of a sudden God's not really God anymore. He's not really the master anymore. Can we know him as a loving Father and still bow down to him as Lord? In John 15, Jesus calls us friends, but it's in the midst of the context of us coming to that place of absolute surrender as a vine to the branch. We still are in that place where we are drawing completely from him, even though he's called us friends. He tells us that if we truly know the love of God and love him, then we will keep his commandments. This is quite a struggle. This is quite a contrast that Jesus is bringing here. He's saying, you're my friend, but I am Lord and Master, and you've got to draw from me. You say you love me, and I love you, but out of that love, you've got to keep my commandments. So there's a relationship that Jesus is bringing us into, but it's not a relationship where we bring him down. It's always a relationship where he's lifting us up, and he's holding us up. And yet, in the world, and in today's Christianity, that seems to be sometimes getting a little mixed up. Kind of bringing God down. We're not putting him in that place of honor and understanding and respect that he needs to have. We can understand Peter's response. You will never wash my feet. I don't want to lose respect for you. I know my heart. I know how I struggle with this. Don't put me in this place, Jesus. I don't want to lose respect for you. I want to honor you as master. I want to keep you up there. And so Peter is struggling with this. He's struggling with this. He knows what's going on inside of him. But this is where we need to walk, knowing God's incredible love and mercy and still standing in awe of his justice and his power. And I think that that's a struggle. We need to know his love. We need to know his grace. We need to know how much he cares for us, but we must never lose the fact that he is Lord and King and that we are surrendered completely to him. In knowing that we've been freed from the law and are called to liberty, yet knowing that we are restrained by the law of love and are called to be sanctified. Knowing that God accepts us and loves us perfectly, yet knowing that we must cooperate with him in being conformed to the image of Christ. Jesus told Peter that he didn't understand fully now, but that he would. And that it was necessary for Peter to receive God's purpose in action in that particular situation. So often we want God to conform to us instead of us conforming to God. And Peter's response was to go way the other direction. If you're going to focus on my unworthiness, Peter says, well then you better wash all of me. If we're going to look at my unworthiness, that's what this is really about. Wash me totally, Jesus. Jesus says again to Peter, you're missing the point. It's not about the washing, but it's about service. It's coming to serve. So ultimately, what was Jesus' message? God must remain the center of all, not man. God is always the center. He is the Lord. He is the King. As soon as we see things man-centered, we pull God down, we lose sight of His authority and His will and His purpose. When we keep it God-centered, we can accept God's love and care for us while still keeping Him in His proper place of Lord and Master and King of the universe. This is something that this generation is struggling with, as did Jesus' generation. In Matthew 11:16-19, He says this, but to what shall I liken this generation? It's like children sitting in the marketplace and calling to their companions, saying, we played the flute for you, and you did not dance. We mourned to you, and you did not lament. For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say he has a demon. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. They say, look, a glutton, a winebibber, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is justified by her children. When man is at the center, we call God to dance to our tune. Come on, God, I'm playing the music. Come on, why aren't you dancing? God, I'm mourning. This is what my problem is. You know, we want God to solve what we think is the biggest problem in our life, and He's trying to deal with something else. He says, no, I think this is more important right now. But God, this. God says, I think this is more important right now. So when we're making it man-centered, we want God to do what we want to do. But we want God to rejoice in what we rejoice and mourn in what we mourn. But instead, we need to mourn over what God mourns and rejoice over what God rejoices. And that's where we need to come to. So the call is to become a kingdom of servants. Verses 14 and 15 of our text, it says, if then your Lord and teacher have washed your feet, you ought also to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. So ultimately, Jesus was teaching His disciples how to serve one another. Disciples have spent a lot of time arguing over who would be the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Luke reveals this conflict in Luke 22, verse 24. It says, now there was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest. He said to them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and those who exercise authority over them are called benefactors. But not so among you. On the contrary, he who is greatest among you, let him be your younger, and he who governs as he who serves. For who is greater, he who sits at the table or he who serves? Is it not he who sits at the table? Yet I am among you as one who serves. So Jesus' challenge to them was not to be like the Gentiles. We are not to take our cues from the customs of this world. We are to seek to serve one another. One preacher mused that they were arguing about this on the way to this particular supper. And when they arrived at the supper, they were all tired and their feet were dirty. And yet, because of their discussion and pride, not one of them would stoop down to do the feet washing. So you can imagine, here's the 12 disciples, they're all sitting there around the table, looking at each other, waiting for someone to go and get the water and do the washing. And so they're, no, I'm not going to do it. He should do it. He's the youngest. He should do it. He's not very important. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to lower myself to do that. And so here they are, sitting in this pride after having this discussion and fight of who's going to be the greatest, and all of a sudden, Jesus takes off his cloak and begins to wash their feet. I think when you picture it that way, it just brings a real impact, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Might have been that part of why Peter said, you can't wash my feet. No, Jesus, please don't do this. You're humiliating me even worse. But that was the call. That was what Jesus was demonstrating. That the greatest in the kingdom of heaven is those who will become the servant, those who will bow down and give of themselves. I think that God really wants to help us to have a different spirit, to make serving others as important as serving ourselves. Have that heart and that spirit to say, Lord, whose feet can I wash today? Who can I serve? Who can I reach down to and love? And to just bring that care into that situation. And not only will it bless that person, but it will change us. It will help us to understand where God wants us to be. Dear Lord Jesus, today I thank you. Lord, we're just in awe. What are we that you would stoop down to acknowledge us? Lord of the universe, the one who created the heavens and the earth, the one who made the sun and the moon and the stars and all that is there. You stoop down to acknowledge man. Not only that, you went so far as you died on the cross for us. Lord, I pray that you would help us to see the incredibleness of that grace, because in doing that, you are still Lord and Master. But you have loved us with an incredible love. You love us passionately. You love us with everything that you can pour out upon us. So Lord, I pray that you would help us to see what you did, and then to emulate that and to seek to serve the people around us. Lord, that we would find opportunities to take off our cloak, that cloak of privilege, that cloak of position, that cloak of pride, and lay it aside and just serve and love and care. Lord, that's what you've called us to do as your people. I pray that you would work it in our hearts, and we thank you for it today in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.